Quebec, Canada, 2011. A man is halfway up a tower of barrels when the world shifts under his feet. He is there to do something boring: inventory, counting, confirming what everyone already assumes is true. Instead, the barrel beneath him rocks like it's hollow. He grabs for balance. His heart spikes. For a split second, he almost falls, because that barrel should weigh something like 620 pounds, around 280 kilograms, when it's full. It should not move like that. It should not feel light. It should feel like a mistake to even try. They crack open a lid. They expect maple syrup. Water splashes back at them. And in that moment, the warehouse stops being a warehouse. It becomes a crime scene. Because the barrels are still there. The stacks still look full. Nothing looks broken. No alarms. No gunshots. No dramatic night where anyone can say, "That's when it happened." Yet the numbers start to come in. And they are insane. Thousands of barrels affected. Nearly 3,000 tons missing. About 18.7 million Canadian dollars gone. And the part that makes this story addictive is the missing moment. There is no single scene where the thieves burst in and grab the syrup. There is no security footage of masked men sprinting across a yard. Which means only one thing can be true. The people who did this didn't break in. They walked in. So if you're hearing this for the first time, you're asking the same question everyone asked when those barrels were opened. How? How do you steal tens of millions of dollars worth of syrup from a strategic reserve, replace it with water, and keep the warehouse looking full long enough that nobody notices until an inspector nearly falls off the stack? To answer that, we have to rewind. Back before the barrel went light. Back before anyone knew the sweetest commodity in Canada had become contraband. Back to the men who looked at routine and saw camouflage. Before we meet the thieves, you need to understand what they were stealing and why it mattered. Maple syrup is easy to underestimate, if you only know it as a bottle on a table. In Quebec, it's an industry with global weight. The province supplies most of the world's maple syrup, and for decades, a powerful federation has regulated the flow of syrup through quotas and a strategic reserve, designed to stabilize supply and price. In other words, it's not just food. It's a controlled commodity. At the scale of this reserve, syrup isn't stored in pretty bottles. It's stored in industrial barrels. A barrel holds about 54 gallons, roughly 205 liters. A full barrel can weigh about 600 to 620 pounds, around 270 to 280 kilograms. And each barrel can be worth around 1,800 Canadian dollars. Now do the math in your head, the way a thief would. 1,000 barrels isn't breakfast. It's an entire house, a lifetime of wages, a business. And the warehouse in St. Louis de Blanford held thousands of them. This was rented storage space, quiet, ordinary, forgettable. Not a bank vault, not a fortress. Just a place built for forklifts and shipping schedules, and paperwork. That detail matters because warehouses are designed for movement. Barrels go in. Barrels go out. Trucks arrive. Trucks leave. So the security was shaped around the wrong fear. There was a guard, but the guard's job was the gate and the yard. Stop strangers. Watch the perimeter. Keep out the obvious threat. The guard wasn't walking the aisles at night, weighing barrels, checking what's inside. And the barrels were inspected on a slow schedule, which is the kind of detail a normal person hears and forgets, but the kind of detail a criminal hears and circles. Because slow inspections don't just create a gap. They create time. And time is the single most valuable tool in a theft like this. A thief with time can turn a warehouse into a machine. And that's exactly what happened. Richard Vallières did not need to be violent to do this. He needed to be patient, and he needed to be realistic about what the world actually pays attention to. He lived in Quebec's syrup world. He knew the product wasn't cute. He knew it was money. He knew people built rules around it because rules only exist where value exists. And at some point, he did the calculation every ambitious thief eventually does. Not the moral calculation, the logistical one. First, he looked at the warehouse and asked a simple question. What would get me caught? A break-in would get him caught. A smashed lock, a forced door, a strange vehicle at a strange hour. Anything that creates a single dramatic moment. So he didn't build a plan around force. He built a plan around normal. He understood something most people never need to understand. In an industrial place, the most powerful disguise is legitimacy. A truck that belongs there does not raise alarms. A forklift doing forklift things doesn't raise alarms. A driver holding paperwork doesn't raise alarms. And the guard outside, the one trained to stop strangers, can't stop a stranger if the stranger never looks like one. Now the second question. How do you steal syrup without creating an absence? Because barrels are obvious. You can count barrels. You can notice empty space. But syrup is liquid. Syrup can be moved in silence. So he designed the theft around a trick that sounds childish until you realize how perfect it is. Don't steal the barrel. Steal what's inside. Then he had to solve 3 real problems. 1. Access. He needed barrels to leave and come back without anyone treating it as suspicious. 2. Extraction. He needed somewhere private to open barrels, siphon syrup, and transfer it into other containers. 3. Selling. He needed to turn syrup into money without dumping a giant flood into the market and getting noticed. This is where the crime becomes a project. Because you can't do it with one guy and a hose. You need a crew. You need someone who can drive. Someone who can move barrels. Someone who can keep quiet. Someone who can handle the mechanics of the operation. That's where Avik Karen comes in, described as the man running the day-to-day theft operation. And then, the place. The remote sugar shack. Not a movie hideout, just a rural location where nobody asks why a truck is parked for hours. Where a pump can hum without anyone calling police. Where syrup can be poured into tanks, repackaged, and prepared for transport. Now, the selling problem. Here's what makes Vallières dangerous. He didn't imagine a single buyer showing up with a suitcase of cash. That's not how commodities move. He understood you sell syrup the way you sell anything that has real demand. In pieces, small batches, through middlemen, through channels where a product like syrup looks ordinary. Because once syrup leaves the barrel, it has no serial number. It has no identity. It can be mixed, rebottled, blended into other stock. It becomes just syrup again. That's the terrifying advantage. And when he put all of that together, the plan didn't look like a robbery. It looked like a supply chain. It looked like work. Now comes the part every criminal remembers forever. The first execution. The first run is where you find out if the world is awake. A truck approaches the gate. The guard sees a normal vehicle, a normal driver, a normal moment. The gate opens. Paper gets signed. A forklift lifts a barrel. And that barrel leaves the warehouse like it belongs to routine. No one panics, because nothing looks wrong. Later, at the remote site, the lid comes off. A hose goes in. The pump starts. Syrup drains out. And then the trick that kept the warehouse looking full. They refill the barrel with water to preserve weight. Not perfect weight, but close enough to fool anyone who wasn't checking right then. The barrel is resealed. Returned. Restacked. From far away, the warehouse still looks full. And that's why they weren't caught at the beginning. Because the plan didn't create a dramatic moment. It created a quiet lie that could sit there for months. And once they got away with it once, the operation scaled. More barrels. More runs. More syrup. Success made them confident. Confidence made them bolder. And boldness eventually made them sloppy, siphoning directly from barrels without always refilling properly. That's the arc of greed. Careful at first. Reckless later. And recklessness is what finally gives the real world something to grab. The truth is, the heist didn't end because someone suddenly became a genius detective. It ended because a system finally touched reality. Inventory. A man climbing a stack. A barrel that should have felt heavy. And suddenly, instead of a neat warehouse full of value, you had a warehouse full of doubt. Once the water was found, the investigation had two jobs: find where the syrup went, and find who had the access to move it. But syrup is not a stolen painting. It's a commodity. So the police couldn't chase the syrup like an object. They had to chase movement. They started with the boring stuff, because that's where commodity crimes hide. They asked for shipping records. They asked who had rented forklifts, trucks, storage space. They asked who had shown up at odd hours with perfectly normal paperwork. They asked who in that ecosystem suddenly had syrup they couldn't explain. And here's the first curious clue that makes this case feel like a thriller. The thieves didn't just steal syrup. They also stole time. They leaned on the fact that the barrels weren't being weighed constantly, which means when police stepped into the warehouse after the discovery, they weren't looking for footprints. They were looking for patterns. Which rows had more light barrels? Which stacks had been disturbed more often? Which seals looked like they'd been opened and resealed? Because even when criminals try to be clean, the physical world has habits. A forklift leaves marks. A barrel moved and returned doesn't land perfectly the same way every time. A resealed lid doesn't always sit with the same wear pattern. And if you are patient enough, those tiny physical tells become a map. From there, the investigation moved outward. A heist like this becomes profitable only if you sell. And selling creates the real trail. To move this much syrup, the crew had to make deals. They had to contact buyers, exporters, distributors. They had to turn syrup into money, and money always leaves a shadow. So police started following unusual syrup flows, looking for places where large quantities showed up outside the normal system. And one of the biggest breaks came when authorities found a major stash far away from the reserve, connected to an exporter's storage facility in New Brunswick. That discovery did two things at once. It confirmed the syrup had been trafficked through real commercial channels. And it gave investigators a physical anchor outside Quebec. A place with rental agreements, keys, truck logs, employee schedules, phone numbers. That's the detail people miss about modern investigations. They don't just chase villains, they chase infrastructure. Because infrastructure is paperwork, and paperwork is a confession. Once police had that stash, they could start pulling threads in both directions. Who had access to that facility? Who moved barrels in and out? Who paid for transport? Who made the calls? Who suddenly had new money? And this is where human weakness enters, because even the smartest operation breaks when people get greedy. Someone talks. Someone brags. Someone tries to sell too much too quickly. Someone uses a contact who isn't as careful. Someone gets nervous and makes a mistake on a call. We don't need a single magical clue. We need what always happens when a crime becomes large. It becomes social. And social crimes leak. The pressure builds until police can see the network instead of the product. In December 2012, that pressure turns into action. Arrests begin. And the key figures are swept up, including Richard Vallières. When the operation finally collapses, it collapses hard, because there's no way to explain away thousands of barrels of missing syrup as a misunderstanding. The courtroom phase turns the heist into roles: organizer, operator, drivers, resellers, and the punishments reflect those roles. Vallières, identified as the ringleader, receives the harshest outcome: 8 years in prison and a massive financial penalty tied to the value of what wasn't recovered. Karen, described as the operational lead, receives 5 years and a major fine. Others receive shorter sentences, probation, or smaller penalties, depending on what could be proven. And after court, the industry doesn't just move on. Because the real damage isn't only the money, it's the lesson. That a strategic reserve can be emptied without a single gunshot if you protect it like a warehouse and not like a vault. That routine can be an invisibility cloak. That a man who understands paperwork and timing can steal millions not by breaking in, but by acting like he belongs. And that is why this story still hits. Because it wasn't dramatic. It was precise. It was quiet. And it took an inspector climbing a stack, feeling a barrel shift, and watching water splash back at him to reveal that the sweetest reserve in Quebec had been drained by the most terrifying kind of thief. The kind who never looks like a thief.